Hey everyone, welcome back to the 28-day Acts Challenge. I am so thankful that you are sticking with us for this whole big giant book of Acts. I'm so proud of you for taking on this challenge. Today we are going to talk about Acts chapter 23. So I want to start with the question. Okay, what do you think? Does God have a plan for your life? All right, ponder it for a second. Well, here in Acts chapter 23, things get tough for Paul. Things are just really difficult for Paul. Paul is sent before the Jewish high priest council. This is called the Sanhedrin. And Paul, even though he's brought against these really powerful people, he gets really bold. He gets really bold right there in Acts 23, and he ends up calling out the high priest Ananias. He calls him out on his hypocrisy, and Paul kind of in this moment, he runs his mouth. He calls Ananias a whitewashed wall. In those ancient terms, this means that he is a hypocrite, someone who appears to be good on the outside, but on the inside really isn't. So Paul, he's throwing out these words, and he gets this council of Sanhedrin. He gets them so riled up, and then he starts poking some of their close buttons. He starts to bring up the hope for the resurrection of the dead. Now, here are some interesting facts. So the Pharisees, they believe in the resurrection of the dead, but the Sadducees, who are also a part of this council, they don't believe in it. So Paul knows that he's kind of poking the bear. Think of it this way. It's like if you got a bunch of Lutherans and a bunch of Baptists together and you had them talking about baptizing babies versus baptizing adults or people who are at the age of accountability. It would just create this great big giant debate. And this debate is what happens here in Acts 23. But here's the thing about this debate. This debate gets violent. It gets to the point where they end up having to pull Paul out and put him into a safe zone. It becomes so violent that the Romans are the ones who actually decide to put Paul into protective custody. And that seems really strange to us because we would assume that the religious people would be the ones to do that work. But it's the Romans who take Paul and they go and put him into the barracks, which means that they have put him into protective custody because of all the violence that the Sanhedrin is talking about and is accompanying. But this is what I really find is really interesting. So Paul is put into this protective custody by the Romans. And in verse 11, I find this just to be beautiful. So here he is in this protective custody. And this is what it says. It says, "That night the Lord stood near him and said, 'Keep up your courage. For just as you have testified for me in Jerusalem, so you must bear witness also in Rome.'" You see, God here, Jesus here, is encouraging Paul right in the middle of all of this conflict going on. He could have seen all this conflict, confusion as some bad days. Paul could have experienced this as just a really sad situation. But God keeps pushing Paul forward. Keep up your courage, Paul. Keep going all the way to Rome. So my friends, I want to wonder with you, are you worried about your future? Or are you facing challenges or opposition? Or are you in your life in a time of crisis? Or do you feel like someone's out there plotting against you? But for Paul, there was. And for many of us, it seems like these things happen to us too. People seem against us, or we're in a time of crisis. You see, the Romans, they had one plan for Paul's life. And the Jewish leaders, the Sanhedrin, they had a different plan for Paul's life. But God used all of these people's different plans in order to fulfill God's plan for Paul's life. I think when we talk about God's plan for our lives, we often apply it as platitudes in difficult times. Like when someone loses a pregnancy and they say something like, "Well, it was all part of God's plan." But here's the truth. If tragedy was part of God's plan, then it's not the kind of God that I want to worship. God that makes people lose pregnancies. God that gives kids cancers and lets loving grandpas die. Did God plan for the Jewish leadership to plot to kill Paul? No, I don't really think so. But God still did good work through it, all for Paul's good and for the good of the sake of the gospel. Yes. So if I didn't lose the pregnancies that I lost, I wouldn't have my beautiful daughter, Skylar. But I don't think that God made me lose those pregnancies. We tend to think of it as an equation like this. Does God have a plan for my life? Either or circumstances. Either God directs our steps and has it all worked out, or we're all just free to do whatever we want. But I don't think that that's the case. I actually think it's more of a both and. For Paul, he had both the chance to do or say what his free will allowed him to do. Maybe it was his free will that made him call Ananias the hypocrite. But God kept also working things for God's good. Both Paul's free will and God's plan. Both free will and surrender. And here's the main thing. God continued to be with Paul through all of it and encouraged him, saying, "Keep up your courage." Paul both surrendered to God and also let God direct his steps at the same time. Paul used his own action and his own choice to accomplish them. I think it's both free will and surrender. So I want to wonder with you right now, are you in a time in your life of action or a time of surrender? Or maybe it's both at the same time. It feels a little messy in your crisis situation. But I want to encourage you, like God encouraged Paul, keep up your courage. God has got you through all of it. So here are my questions for you today. Number one, how do you see God using your circumstances today for your or somebody else's spiritual benefit? And number two, today, are you going to choose action or are you going to choose surrender, and why? Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.